Hello everyone. Now we are going to discuss The Age of Johnson, the novel in this video. Come, let's go. It is impossible to dogmatize. We all know that though it is impossible to dogmatize and useless to quarrel about the actual beginnings in England of that particular kind of prose fiction, which we now call the novel, it is quite safe to say that its firm establishment and assured popularity date from the age of Johnson and may indeed be accounted the greatest achievement of this age. It may also be fairly contended that it was with Richardson that prose fiction paused definitely into its modern form. But a rapid survey of the evolution of English fiction before his time is necessary in order that we may place him in his proper historical position. We have seen that a certain amount of prose fiction had been produced during the age of Shakespeare, notwithstanding the fact that imaginative energy had then found its chief outlet in the drama. So, most of this fiction had been purely romantic, as with Sidney, Lodge, and Green, or didactic, as with Moore, Lilly, and Bacon. But a slight tendency to realism had been shown in the picaresque work of Nash. A little later, the long winded heroic romance, a strange compound of sham chivalry, sham pastoralism, pseudo history, and the extravagant gallantry of a sophisticated society, was imported from France, where for the moment it was immensely popular, and along with many other French fashions, it enjoyed a temporary vogue on English soil. Afrobin and several other women writers, so they began to cultivate a form of story which was marked by brevity and concentration of treatment, and which, while still radically conventional in matter and method, it showed by a contrast a certain desire to get back to truth and nature. Okay, and then uh, meanwhile a number of extraneous influences were at work, all contributing, as we can now see the transformation of prose fiction into something which, despite all superficial similarities, was to be essentially unlike of its previous varieties. Among them, as we have noted, the work of the character writers, and much more important of Addison and Steele in the periodical essay. Moreover, Bunyan's marvelously effective use of fiction as allegory has to be recognized. And emphasis must also be laid upon the increasing popularity of biography, the forms and methods of which it is evident could very easily be carried over from historical into fictitious narrative. So, this is a matter which, as we remember, it is of special interest in connection with the tales of Defoe. And here the question already touched open the evolution of fiction, that by rejecting, as he did, all the fantastic conventions of romance and adopting it with studious preciseness, the manner and tone of actual biography. So, what are the historical significance? So, before we turn to Richardson, however, we may fittingly pause to lay stress upon the great historical significance of the novel from both the literary and the social points of view. So, the following points should be carefully considered. So, in the first place, the popularity of the novel, like that of the periodical essay which immediately preceded it, coincided with and very largely depended upon the growth of miscellaneous reading public, and of a public in which women were becoming increasingly numerous and influential. Secondly, as practically a new form of literary art, the novel was a sign that literature was beginning to outgrow the cramping limitation of classism and to abandon the doctrine that modern genius was bound to go in the leading strings of tradition. So, in the epic and the drama, it was impossible as it that men should reject altogether the authority of antiquity. In the novel, that authority could be ignored. There was indeed, as notably in Fielding's case, some discussion of technical questions from the classist standpoint and an occasional parade of classical learning. But in general, the novel offered a fresh field in which modern writers were able to work independently. Third, the rise of the novel was one result of the democratic movement in 18th century England. The romance, like tragedy, had been almost consistently aristocratic in the range of its interests and characters. And even Defoe, while he repudiated romantic conventions in this as in all other respects, still, as we have said, held aloof from the ordinary social world, merely substituting adventures and criminals for princes and Arcadian shepherds. The comprehensiveness of the novel, its free treatment of the characters and doings of all sorts and conditions of men, and especially its sympathetic handling of middle class and lowly life, are unmistakable evidences of its democratic quality. Okay, and then as Lord Morley has said of Pamela, it was the landmark of a great social, no less than a great literary transition when all England went mad with enthusiasm over the trials, the virtues, the trims of a rustic lady's maid. Finally, as the form of the novel gives a far wider scope than it is allowed by the corresponding form of the drama for the treatment of motives, feelings, and all the phenomena of the inner life. It intended from the first to take a peculiar place as the typical art form of the introspective and analytical modern world. And then Samuel Richardson. So he was a prosperous printer and an embodiment of all the properties. Okay, so then the thought occurred to him that such a story, if written in an easy and natural manner suitable to the simplicity of it, it might possibly introduce a new species of writing, turn young people into a course of reading different from the pomp and parade of romance writing, and tend to promote the cause of religion and virtue. So, the proposed ready letter writer was for the moment set aside, and Pamela or virtue rewarded came into being. Okay, as a piece of art, it is mainly interesting from the historical point of view, and because it presents in a rather crude from the peculiar methods which were afterwards used with a much surer hand and with much finer effect in its two successors, Clarissa or The Adventures of a Young Lady, which was generally known as Clarissa Harlowe and Sir Charles Grandison. So Clarissa is Richard's masterpiece. It gave him a European reputation. Okay, and then Fielding, he was a greatest of them all. He was a man of very different type. He was a virile, vigorous, and somewhat coarse nature, and his knowledge of life, as wide as Richardson, was narrow. It included, in particular, many aspects of it from which the prim little printer would have recoiled, shocked. Okay, and then it was The History of Tom Jones. It was the greatest novel of the 18th century. So here Fielding takes an enormous canvas and crowds it with figures. So country men and manners fill the first part, metropolitan men and manners the second part of the book, and which as a whole gives us our fullest and richest picture of English life about the middle of the 18th century. So Fielding's third great novel, Amelia, which was appeared in 1751. And then his own first experiment in the novel was a different direct offshoot from the first experiment of Richardson. Okay, what to say? The success of Richardson and Fielding naturally prompted him to try his hand in fiction, and Smollett, he wrote half a dozen novels. The most important of his works are The Adventures of Roderick Random, The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker. So, Smollett conceived the novel as a large diffused picture of life. His fertility of invention and animation are undoubtedly remarkable. So, alike in the looseness of his composition, in his dependence upon action, and in the nature of his subjects, he reverts to the picturesque type of fiction. Smollett wrote expressly as a satirist and reformer, and that his purpose was to paint the monstrous evils of life in their true proportions and the colors that he might thus drive them home upon the attention of the public. Okay, so some of the famous writers of this period are it is natural to speak first of Goldsmith's one excursion into the field of fiction, that is the Vicar of Wakefield. So, in structure, this shows that, like Smollett, Goldsmith had learned little of the art of the novel from the precepts and the practice of fielding. So, for its plot is ill concatenated, full of glaring improbabilities, and huddled up in the most ludicrous manner at the close. So, we are ready to make a similar allowance for the technical defects of his work because it is instinct with his peculiar charm and tenderness, and because its materials are handled with that transfiguring power which touches the simplest details with idyllic beauty. Its humor is perennially delightful, and while much of its characterization is purely conventional. So, reference must next to be made to the strange work of a very strange man, that is the Rev. Lawrence Sterne, whose life and opinions of Tristram Shandy, gentleman, appeared in 9 volumes from 1759 to 1767. So, this hardly can be called a novel. Okay, because it is rather a medley of unconnected incidents, scraps of out of the way learning, whimsical fancies, humor, pathos, reflection, impotence, indecency, and all kind of things we could see in this work. Okay, and then when we talk about Tobias Smollett, okay, so he's usually associated with Richardson and Fielding. We all have seen that. Okay, and then the revival of romance. So Anne Radcliffe, he gained an immense public. So she gained an immense public by her Romance of the Forest, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and the Italian. So I hope you're all familiar of The Mysteries of Udolpho. It was such a wonderful work. And then Matthew Gregory Lewis, he now best remembered for his personal relations with Scott. He achieved a great success on somewhat similar lines with his first book Ambrosio or The Monk. It was published only at the age of 20. Okay, and then The Castle of Otranto and The Mysteries of Udolpho, though it outdoors both in the wild sensationalism, it gains popularity. Okay, so there is little in the productions of either of these writers, and we must remember that they did much to stimulate and fertilize the genius of Scott. Okay, and then in early life, no, this small, he spent some years as a man, as surgeon on a man of war. Okay, so he produced a large amount of miscellaneous work including history of England. He wrote half a dozen novels. His fertility of invention and animation are undoubtedly remarkable. So with this we have reached the end of the discussion on The Age of Johnson, the novel. Hope you all are clear with the points which I have been discussing so far. So thank you for your patient listening.